to help with mental health and mental wellness right now. So encourage everyone to go to Energize Colorado, and we have great resources that if you are just looking to get some help on your own, whether it is things you can read about better ways to better manage stress right now during this, or some of the anxieties people are dealing with, there's great resources on Energize Colorado there. We also have some great partners, including Simple Habit and Mindspace, that have offered free access to their apps from meditation perspective, and just some help stuff to help them with mindfulness. And the last thing I'd love to remind everyone about is we have a great program that is offering free access to therapy right now for folks that have been impacted by COVID and really just need someone to talk to. And so if you go to Energize Colorado and to the mental health resources, you can be connected for free with a mental health professional right now to help you with that. So please encourage everyone to go do that and check that out. So jumping into the panel today, we have Scott here to talk about how stress is impacting your brain during this and some ways to deal with that. Introducing Scott here has just an incredibly impressive background. He's a professor at the Daniels College of Business at the University of Denver, and is also active in the private sector as well, both as a partner with management consulting as well as a board member as well. And he is a faculty lead in the executive leadership and global business course in the executive MBA program at the University of Denver. Previously, prior to Scott moving into academia and consulting, he spent 25 years in industry and has held a bunch of senior executive roles with really large global companies, including Fisher Controls and Emerson Electric. And as part of his work that he's done, on the leadership perspective, one of the things that led Scott to invest in this area is just realizing the impact that stress has on leaders, both personally and how they're showing up for leaders for their team. And so really excited to learn from Scott today. So with that, we'd love to turn it over to him. And Scott, super excited to have you here, and we're all really excited to hear from you.
Thanks, Chris. Really excited to be here. I'm sitting and welcome into my office in my house in Fraser, Colorado. In typical Colorado fashion, we had 3 inches of snow on the ground yesterday in June, and today is shaping up to be a beautiful blue sky day with 60 degrees. So, figure that. But really, really excited about spending some time with you on this today. I'm going to share my screen real quick here, and we'll get going. Just a little quick background on this subject, as Chris kind of mentioned. I did about 25 years in the corporate world and held a lot of leadership positions in that world, and went on and have spent now 15 years at Daniels in the world of academia. And I'm also, as a background, I'm also an engineer, and so I've been a science guy most of my life. And so when I went to the other side of the table, from being an actual practicing leader to going into academia and teaching leadership to business leaders, I really got interested in the emerging science around leadership. And it turns out that probably a significant portion of the research and the things that are going on in the world of organizational behavior and human behavior and leadership is actually in the world of neuroscience, which is a little bit different than psychology in that it's physiological. It's about how your brain works. So I became very fascinated with this whole subject and have spent the last 10 or 15 years getting more and more background on neuroscience, and actually a new term that I'll introduce you to called NeuroLeadership, which is essentially applying the theories of neuroscience and the science of neuroscience into the practice of leadership and organizational behavior. So I became very fascinated with this, and I've got on the screen a couple books that I would just recommend if you're interested in this subject. The first one I read was the one on the left, Your Brain at Work, by David Rock, and David has been the real leader in this area, and is in fact the managing director of the NeuroLeadership Institute. The other one is Activate Your Brain by Scott Halford, who is a Denver person, a friend of mine, who's also done a lot of great work in and around this subject. So the bottom line is that as leaders, as just individuals, learning about our brain and how it works and the kinds of things that are happening, I think is very, very valuable. And one of the things that I always like to point out is that so much of what happens in our brain is unconscious to us. It is something we're not realizing what's happening and therefore can't manage it. So to the degree you can learn about your brain and all of the unconscious processes that are happening, you can be better equipped to manage your own behavior and the behavior of those around you. So that's where my interest came. So I'm not going to spend a bunch of time going through an anatomy diagram, but I did want to give you a really quick overview of the structure of the brain so that you can kind of understand how some of the things that we're going to talk about fit. So looking at this diagram, if we look down at the bottom of the screen that I'm circling right now, that blue, light blue area, two major pieces here. This item right here is called your brain stem. Your brain stem is responsible, it sits right at the top of your spine, and it's responsible for managing your basic physiology. So your heart rate, your respiration, etc. This large area right here is your cerebellum, and it manages basically your movement, your balance. It's a very large part of your brain because it manages our movement. Moving into sort of the middle of our brain, this is a critical area called the limbic system. And there's a number of different organs inside of this, but a couple of them to note: thalamus is where your senses, all your senses but smell, come into your thalamus. So that's where our sensations of the world come. Another one, your hippocampus here, manages a number of things, but including your short-term memory. And then a very important one called your amygdala, which is essentially the storage or memory of your experiences of your life, and particularly how you felt about those. And so the limbic system is essentially what we would call your feeling brain. And it has been developed, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. And then finally, at the top is our neocortex, is our thinking brain. And if you think about it from an evolutionary perspective, we started out with what's often called the reptilian brain, which is our brain stem. It moved up into our limbic system, or our feeling brain was developed second, and then our thinking brain was developed third. Just a couple other things. We as humans have the largest neocortex, the largest thinking brain. And we also have a very important part, which is called our prefrontal cortex, which is right behind our forehead. And that is our executive decision brain. And that is the part of our brain that makes us really different from other species. So our brain is layered. All these pieces are integrated together. And it's just important to understand kind of how these things fit together. So this is where we get into some of the things associated with our behavior and with stress. Back to the limbic system, which is right here. Our limbic system, again, is our feeling brain, but a good way of thinking about it is it's our brain's alarm system. And what that means essentially is that 24/7, 365, our limbic system is monitoring what's going on around us. And it's asking itself, is anything that's going on right now similar to anything else I've experienced in my life? And if there's a match, it asks, is it something that was a threat, something that I was scary or was sad, or was it actually a positive feeling, which we would call a reward response? And so our limbic system basically is monitoring the world. What's going on outside? Is there anything I should be worried about right now? Or is there anything I should be really happy about right now? And if there is, what it does is sends a signal to our prefrontal cortex. And that signal is either a threat response, which is beware, move away from this could be dangerous. on the other side, if it's a toward response, this is something positive. This is something you need to move towards. So it's sending an impulse to our prefrontal cortex to tell us what to do. Now, a very important point on this, by the way, is that a threat response is about 5 times more powerful than a toward response. So we tend to be more dominated by our threat responses, our reactions to things that are going on around us that we should be afraid of, or a threat response. Okay, so very important to understand this. All the time we are getting signals that are telling us from our limbic system, telling us whether we have a threat or a toward response. So I want to make a quick definition that I find very valuable, and that is, I like to make a distinction between pressure and stress. I think today we use the word stress a little bit wrong. And so when I talk about pressure, it's the things that are going on around us that happen to all of us all the time. So it's the things that come at us from our external environment that are pressure. Then what happens is our brain reacts to that pressure. And that is essentially what stress is. And I'm going to get a little bit deeper into that here in a minute. But keep in mind, we all experience pressure, the pressures of everyday life. Stress is what our brain does with that pressure. So think about where we are today. In just the world of COVID, COVID has given us a huge disruption in our life in a lot of different ways. Obviously, it's impacted our personal and professional routines. And we are, as human beings, habitual in nature. Some research would say that almost half of the decisions we make every day are just routine. We're on autopilot. We don't think about them. It's just kind of our routine. And all of a sudden, in comes this crisis that changes our routines. In fact, interestingly, I got an email from one of my students this morning that said, hey, we went back to work on Monday. And it was so strange to walk in, everybody's wearing a mask, our office had been reconfigured to keep people 6 feet apart. We had all these new procedures to deal with. And she goes, all of a sudden going to work was a whole new routine again. And so recognize that those kinds of things impact us. Some of us have concerns about either ourselves or in our families or in our close vicinity to us. We're worried about potentially health issues associated with COVID or financial issues associated with COVID. So those concerns are out there with people. So that's a big deal. Uncertainty. Who knows what's going to happen with all of this? I was with my brother the other day, and he said, don't you wish you could go out a year and look back and see what really happened? I think a lot of us are like that. We're in this uncertainty. Our world is unpredictable. We don't know what to plan, and our brain does not like uncertainty at all. It gets stressed by not having predictability in our lives. Lack of control. A lot of the things that are happening around us are out of our control. So that's an issue. And finally, as human beings, we are social beings. We are meant to be around other people, and social distancing is causing us to not be around people. I got a chance the other day to go out to a restaurant for the first time. And I said to my wife, isn't it great to see people in 3D? Just almost feeling some level of normalcy, being surrounded by people. And so all of those things boiled together are providing, they're all in background, affecting our brain. They're putting pressure on our brain, if you will. By the way, that's not to mention all of the things that have been going on in the last couple of weeks with the racial tensions. And so we have a lot going on in our world of things that are in the background that are causing us stress. One thing I did want to mention, just as a side note here, is that one of the things that I can recommend to you is to really think about what are the putting your time and effort into the things that you can control versus the things that you're out of control, that are out of your control. So I know myself, sometimes I can get glued to the 24-hour news cycle. I can be, sort of constantly looking at the updates of what's going on with COVID, what's going on in the streets, and it can be a background stressor to us without even thinking about it. And there's nothing we can do about it. So the things to do is to focus your energy and your emotions on the things that you can control, and try to, as much as you possibly can, to detach yourself from the things that you can't control. So that's a pretty good thing to think about from a stress perspective. So this is a very important slide, and one that I want to just spend a few minutes on. So the way our brain works is there are different levels. So if you look at the bottom of this, and what we're showing is from the bottom, what we would call calm, up and through 5 different stages, and at the very top we would call terror. So the way that our brain works is this: imagine you are at the bottom of this hierarchy or this taxonomy. You're at the bottom of this, and you are maybe put yourself on vacation. I'm on vacation. We've traveled. We're on the beach. We're relaxed. We have nothing to do, nothing to do but relax. The biggest decision we have to make in our life is, should I have another pina colada or not? So put yourself in that place. In that place, we would say that you are the most open. You have the maximum access to your thinking ability, your cognitive capacity. You have your maximum capability to empathize, to connect with other people. Basically, our brain is at its most open place, okay? Now, as we begin dialing up the pressure or the threat, if you want to use that word, a chemical cocktail starts to go into our body. If we need high arousal for some reason, that will be adrenaline, but most of the time it's what we call cortisol, and cortisol starts flowing through our brains, and cortisol is called the stress hormone. And based on the amount of threat or the amount of pressure we're feeling, our brain begins to narrow its focus. So at the alert level, we might lose a little bit of our cognitive capacity, but we're more focused. As we move up this hierarchy, our brain closes, and at the very top, when you are in the terror range, you literally have no capability to think. You can only reflexively react, and we have no ability to connect with other people at that point. So if any of you are first responders or have ever been in the military or trained, one of the reasons that we train our first responders so heavily is so that when they are facing those absolutely high arousal, high terror situations, that the reflexive response is the right response. Okay, so think about this at the various levels. So on a given day to day, we might go up or down a little bit on this, but in a normal situation, we might spend our time in the bottom 2, maybe the bottom 3 parts of this. Now, on the left side, you'll see level 1, level 2, level 3. What I'm now doing is overlaying the current situation on this model. And what we're saying is, at level 1, we know the COVID crisis is out there. We know it's in the broad environment. We know it's out there. It's in Colorado, it's in Denver, it's in wherever we are, but it hasn't affected us directly. So we're focused, we're alert to it, but it hasn't really affected us. Now, the next level, if we move into level 2, now it's in our neighborhood. Now it's closer to us. Some of our friends or our family, our distant family might have been impacted with it. They might be sick, they might have gotten laid off, whatever those kinds of things might happen would take us up into that alarmed range. And then finally, if it's right on top of us, in other words, somebody in our immediate family, ourselves, we are exposed to a health risk, to getting laid off, to getting having challenging financial issues, whatever those might be, and when it's right on top of us, now we're up pretty high in this hierarchy. And so it's very important to recognize that a lot of this stuff is happening in background. We don't really realize it, but all of those things that have disrupted our lives are moving us up in this stress hierarchy. Another thing to point out is that everybody is experiencing something with this. And so you have to be empathetic to the people around you. And their routines have been disrupted, and so you have to be conscious of the people around you and what might have happened to them. So very important to recognize that. Now, what we know about performance is that actually there's what we call an inverted U with performance. And so if we're down at the bottom of that hierarchy, you may, if I could just go back a minute, excuse me, the wrong way. Sorry, hit the wrong button there. My apologies. So if we're down in this area right here, that calm area, if you've ever gone back to work on the Monday after a vacation or after a nice relaxing weekend, it might be kind of difficult to boot up, to get yourself going, because it takes a little bit of stress to get us alert and focused and on our game. So what happens is we know that every person has got a performance curve where we don't really perform very well down at the bottom. We put a little pressure on ourselves, and we all have an optimal place. It's a medium level, it's a constructive level of stress where we're at our best. If we go beyond that, we start dealing with things like anxiety and disorganization. So again, think about the fact that people are living up in this area. Oftentimes the alert stage is our peak performance. And because of the situation, we're being pushed to the right, and we're being pushed into this area around here. So again, think about this for yourself. Where am I? How am I being impacted by this? Might I just unconsciously have moved to the right? But also all the people around you may very well, based on their personal circumstances, have moved to the right also. So important to recognize that background stress caused by COVID, caused by the current situation with the demonstrations, et cetera, may have pushed us to the right unconsciously. Now, how does that show up? That shows up with the various things that you see. Some levels of anxiety, irritability, shortness, those kinds of things. You may have a hard time concentrating. I've talked to a lot of people who are at home, they've got kids in the background, they are potentially irritable, they are trying to get work done, they're potentially having trouble concentrating. All of those things are caused by this background stress. We can also see mood swings. So stop and ask yourself sometimes, how am I feeling? What are the things that I'm feeling right now? And can I attribute that to some part of this background stress that's going on in the environment that we're in right now? So those are the kinds of internal feelings and emotional symptoms that you might have. Stress. You might also see these with other people. Now, on the other side, how do other people see us? Our behavior can change. And so what happens is that essentially we exaggerate who we are when we're stressed. So if I'm normally a pretty calm and composed person, and I get stressed, all of a sudden I can get impatient, and I can get controlling, and I am now imposing that on the people around me because I'm stressed. So that's important. It's also important to note that it isn't always as a result of people being very, very You may not always be able to tell easily. What we do know is that extroverts tend to express their feelings, maybe like the picture at the top. They'll tend to blurt out what they're feeling or thinking. Oh my God, the world is falling. Whereas introverts will tend to hold it inside, but their body language will tell it all. They will go within themselves. They will shut down. So everybody manifests stress a little bit differently, but you can watch for some of those kinds of behaviors in order to see. One of the things that I think is really important to point out is that stress doesn't just impact you, it impacts everybody around you. So whether it's within your family, whether it's within your workplace, if you're a leader, one of the things that's very important is that your emotions and the way you show up are contagious to those around you. So think about, we have Sheryl Sandberg on this picture on the left. She's smiling, she's open. You have a very different feeling looking at her than you do looking at stressed out dude on the right, who the weight of the world is obviously causing problems. Now think about what it does to you when you look at those two. You are either brought into a positive emotion or you are taken down. So you will literally infect the people around you emotionally by how you show up. And so we want to manage and control ourselves. We don't want to show up stressed. We want to manage our stress to the degree we can and recognize that being positive, having a positive attitude, being optimistic multiplies around you. Very, very important point. So I'll finish with this. How do we manage this? How do we do? Well, the first thing is if you start feeling the things that were on that slide a few minutes ago, you're feeling anxious, you're feeling irritable, you're feeling moody, particularly if you're engaging with other people. There's an acronym that we use called STOP. And STOP basically just says, the first thing is if you're in that mode, just stop and disengage for a moment. And this doesn't have to take a long time, but pull yourself out of the milieu and just get a sense of yourself. The second thing, again, these are in the immediate moment. Breathing is the best thing that we can do to reset our cortisol levels, reset our blood pressure. And what that looks like is those deep, I know many of you probably have been through this, but the deep belly breaths. Breathe in, hold it, breathe out slowly. Do that 3 times. And that will reset your cortisol. That's the best immediate thing that you can do is breathe. If you ever have seen a professional golfer behind a $500,000 putt, they'll stand there, they'll look at their line, and you'll watch them breathing. They're just trying to settle themselves down before they get into action. The third thing is what we call observe, and essentially what that is, and it's surprising how well this works, but it is this idea of label your thoughts and feelings at that moment. So you've taken your breath and you've said, what am I feeling right now? I'm feeling irritable. Why is that? What is the source of that irritability? And what you'll find is that just getting your head around it, labeling that emotion and trying to understand the source of that emotion will manage it, and your brain will let go of it. So it's a very, very powerful. And then finally, proceed with a smile. When we smile, it releases a chemical called oxytocin, and it's very, very hard to be really stressed when we're smiling. So that's an immediate intervention that you can do yourself if you're feeling stress. So stop, breathe, label your emotions, and smile. That will break it right away. Now, in the long term, what are the habits that we can do that will help us manage stress? And a lot of these are really important, but I'm gonna point out a couple. Number one, if I had to pick one thing on this list, it's sleep. Sleep is what re-energizes us. It helps our brain, um, sort of, if you think about your brain as a rechargeable battery, you need to be recharged. And you need, as an adult, you need 7 to 8 hours of sleep. And there's a lot of good stuff out there on sleep hygiene. I've been through this myself in my life. I really worked on it, and I can tell you it changed my life in many ways by getting my sleeping under control. Another one would be exercise. And for our brain, it's cardiovascular exercise. It's 30 minutes and it can be a brisk walk. It can be something like that. But getting your blood moving is what's best for your brain. Um, and finally, the things on the right, I would say that we find that if you can find meaning in your work, meaning in what you're doing, it offsets the stress. So stress associated with positive meaning. So imagine being, for instance, a healthcare worker in this COVID crisis. But if you really feel strongly about what you're doing, you can manage the stress of that moment because you know you're making a difference for people. So obviously a lot of things here for you to think about. I think what I'll do is wrap up and just say it's really important to think about your brain, to understand it, to recognize what's happening to you unconsciously. It's important to recognize what are those symptoms of stress? What are those behaviors? How do those behaviors look? How can I manage myself better? And how can I be empathetic and understand those people around me? So with that, I will see if there's any questions. Glad to answer anything.
Hey, Scott, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Great. A few questions. The first one that's being asked, as a support person to someone who is a terrible sleeper and doesn't exercise either, do you have any suggestions for how to really stress the importance of sleep and sleep hygiene to your partner?
Without being a nag, right? I think there's a couple of things. I know that in the world that I came from, in my generation, there was a machismo about sleeping, and there was a bit of a, well, I only slept 4 hours last night. Some, well, that I pulled an all-nighter, and there was a machismo about it. We know that's not there today. So I think the first thing is just to recognize, and there's a lot of good resources out there. Those books that I mentioned on the outset have got some good sections on sleep. But I think that importance of focusing on the hygiene is just more than anything. It's just saying, listen, in order to manage your stress, in order to manage this, sleep is absolutely critical. And I don't know any other way but to be a nag. And I would say the same thing with exercise. The thing that I would point out about exercise associated, I'm not now talking about getting yourself in physical shape. I'm talking about what's best for your brain. Is a brisk walk is good for your brain. So, one thing you can do as a support person is to say, hey, let's go take a walk. Let's go clear our heads and go out and get outside for a minute. You'll feel a whole lot better. And by the way, if you're pulling somebody away from work, it's a very positive thing. That movement is very positive for them also.
Yep. Scott, one of the things that you mentioned is that, we're obviously in a very stressful time, and a lot of people's maybe normal ways they relieve stress are not available in this, right? You might relieve stress by going out to a restaurant, right? Or going and grabbing a drink for a friend, right? Especially some of these social people who relieve stress through social interactions. And they're not available right now in a lot of ways. Any thoughts on what people can do in replacement for those to help manage the stress or replacement activities?
Yeah, it's funny, when we first started entering the crisis back in late March, I was recommending to people, I got that question a lot, and I was recommending to people to have sort of virtual happy hours and all of those kinds of things. And I do think those are good ways to connect. I can speak for myself and say, after I've spent 5 hours in front of a Zoom screen for the last thing I want to do is do that again. So I don't have I do want to acknowledge and recognize the importance of social interaction. And maybe that is, I have a friend who talks about, he said that we have a monogamous relationship with our next door neighbors, meaning we all know we're not sick. And so we've decided that we can commingle. So our kids can play with each other, and we're willing to sit on the back patio and have a cocktail together or whatever. So I think we're now getting to the point of getting away from isolation and feeling a little bit more comfortable with some small interaction. So that what I would say is recognize that we do crave that. It's that social interaction that we're feeling that we need. And so whatever you can do to, I think, stay safe, but while at the same time doing that.
Yeah. One of the things that we talked about on our last panel was that, we're all in this together and we're all uncomfortable in this, right? And everyone is experiencing some different degree of comfort. And one of the questions, that was just asked is, how do you get people, especially, business owners or entrepreneurs who, possibly dealing with stress is sort of part of their personal mantra, right? Like, I can handle it, I can do it all. How do you get those people to recognize their vulnerability and take some of these self-care steps to improve how they're handling or dealing with stress right now?
Well, the big thing is, I'd go back to some of the things that I talked about is you've got to self-diagnose a little bit. And what I would going back to that one model, what I would say is that what I'm recognizing is a person, let's say a small business entrepreneur who's operating at that focus level, maybe unknowingly has moved up a level.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe they are more anxious and more emotional than they thought. So I think a little bit of standing back and asking yourself what's going on, acknowledging that the things that are going on around me, the different routines, the fact that people around me may be getting sick or maybe in financial distress, the whole uncertainty and all of those things are just, raising the level of threat and anxiety. And let's just acknowledge that. And again, it a little bit gets back to machismo. But I have, when I work with leaders about this, I've got a couple of assessments that I like to use that sort of say, here is an assessment by which you can look at your physical, your sleep, your mental, your emotional, your spiritual, all of those kinds of things, and take a look at yourself and where are you from an energy perspective. And most of them that I'm working with today are saying I am in a bit of a energy crisis is the way that we would say it. So all I can just say is just that importance of acknowledging it. And it's not macho. It's not to just say I can handle this. You need to manage it.
Yep. Yeah, I think along those lines, something that has been helpful too for me in this is acknowledging that, all of the things I was doing before to the same level probably aren't going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And being okay with that.
Yep.
Right. And I think I think for me, acknowledging to myself that I need to be okay with not being great at everything or to the same level before has actually allowed me to, I think, focus better and accept some of that. Another question we had is, a lot of the news cycle and what's going on is causing stress to people, right? And especially with our 24/7 news cycle and the way headlines are written right now, right? They're written for clicks, they're written to, evoke a response, right? But also at the same time, we can't completely ignore what's going on in the world right now. Any thoughts on how to balance knowing what's going on while removing as much of the stress as possible that some of that, repeated and ongoing exposure can cause?
Yeah, I would say further what you said, I think it actually gets a little bit addicting to to just absorb it. And again, I think a lot of it is that news cycle and the way that the things are presented. And I will tell you that I would fall into the category of needing to really watch that. And so with me, I go back to that idea of what I can control is say, I want to, what I've sort of gotten to is saying, I want to be informed, but I don't want to be immersed in it because I can't control it. So I want to be informed on what's happening in Colorado, and what should we be thinking about, because it informs the way that I'm going to operate. It just gives me as much predictability as I can, but I can't let myself get obsessed with it and have it on in the background all the time. So there's two pieces then I'd say is stay informed, but don't be addicted. And number two would say, use it from the perspective of how I can be informed and not feeling like you need to be able to control things, because that's where we really struggle.
Yep, got it. And one last question before we wrap up. You talked earlier about the need for empathy right now, and that's something that our last panel talked as well about. Is helping each other through this, right, and understanding where other people are at. But I think that one of the things that you also mentioned was, as our own stress increases, it is harder to be empathetic to others, right?
Right.
Any tips or tactics on how, while we're in an elevated stress level, to make sure that we're keeping sort of that empathetic mindset, at the forefront, especially as we interact with others and people we're trying to support through this?
Yeah, great question. So again, I would go back to number one, recognizing particularly, I'm involved in the field of leadership a lot, and when I'm talking to leaders, I say recognize that people are following your cues, your verbal and your nonverbal cues. So you have to be hyper aware of A, managing your stress, and B, being able to show up calm. So what that will do is manage you down in that hierarchy, and then the empathetic side of it just says you've got to get down to a level where you've got yourself at a manageable state, so now you can be empathetic to those around you. So the reason for managing your own stress is so that you can be empathetic to those around you. But it's absolutely critical because everybody is in a different place. And, I've had people talk about, hey, I have this super high performer and now they're working from home and things aren't going so well. Well, some of those are, I'm trying to deal with having a lot of young kids running around going to school, or I'm by myself, I'm lonely, I'm having trouble. So you've got to step up and manage yourself so that you can be empathetic to those around you.
Yep, got it. Really helpful. And it looks like we did just have one last question come in. The question is, likely this changes person by person in the best way to respond to a stressor. But is there any scientific evidence that shows, hey, if it's a work stress, the best remedy is exercise, or if it's a personal stress, the best relief is to meditate? Or is it really just a blend of figuring out what works for each of you as an individual?
Yeah, it's a blend and what works for you. The ones that I would say the word I would use would be foundational. Foundational because of the way that our brain works is sleep, is to move, and to the best that you can just find a combination that works for you. The other one that I would say, and this a little bit addresses something that you said a little bit earlier, and that is find a new routine. It's not going to be the one that you were in before. You're not going to be able to, if you're training for a triathlon, you're probably not going to perform at that level, whatever those kinds of things are. But come up with a routine that is now something that you feel comfortable with. But yeah, so no formula, except those are the really critical things that impact you.
Yeah, got it. Well, Scott, thank you so much for your time today. Just to recap what Scott said, and to again draw on some of our panel from last week. Scott, I think at the end you talked about the foundational things, right, that can help with, right? sleep, making sure that you're getting some exercise or some movement and getting outside and doing that. That aligns very much with our panel from last week about making sure that you prioritize time for self-care, right? And I think each of those things are a different form of that, right? And so, we are all dealing with being uncomfortable, dealing with these stresses together. And we heard both last week and today from Scott is, take the time to prioritize those things for yourself, because that's going to put you in a better place, both personally and to be more empathetic and to help everyone around it, because we do need to help each other through this. So Scott, again, thank you for your time today. And as a reminder to everyone watching, please go check out EnergizeColorado.com and access all the mental health and wellness resources that the team has put together. There's a lot of great ways to both learn how to deal with stress. There's free exercise programs on there as well to help with some of the physical things. And then if it's really needed, there's access to free therapy as well that we can help connect you with as part of that. So I hope everyone has a good rest of their Wednesday, and we'll be back again next Wednesday at the same time with another great panel for Wellness Wednesday. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.